They called her the Fire Lady, and every man in Cedar Hollow agreed she had lost her mind the day she torched her own home. She was a Japanese bride who had crossed an ocean to marry a rancher in Montana Territory, and she spent her first weeks in America charring every log wall on the property, while the town stood around and laughed. They said she was destroying the place, that no good could come from a woman who played with fire, and the rancher she had come to marry said nothing at all. She never argued, never explained, never asked a single person to understand. Stay until the end to see what happened when a forest fire swept through Cedar Hollow and found the one structure that wouldn't burn. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The buckboard rolled into Cedar Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon in May of 1883, kicking up a ribbon of yellow dust that hung in the still air like a curtain waiting to part. The town was barely a town, just a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses scattered along a single dirt road that ended where the timber began. The supply wagon had come from the railhead at Bozeman 3 days south, and the woman sitting beside the driver had been on it since the coast. Her name was Yuka, though no one in Cedar Hollow would learn that for weeks. To them, she was only the Japanese woman, the one Nash Tucker had sent for through a marriage broker in San Francisco. She stepped off the buckboard carrying one canvas trunk and a small lacquered box tied with a strip of dark cloth, and the first thing the town noticed was the kimono. Deep blue silk with a pattern of white cranes along the hem, cut close at the collar, worn beneath a dust-coated trail coat that did nothing to hide how out of place she was. Her jet black hair was pinned in a traditional knot at the back of her neck, and her face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, narrow jaw, eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of the wagon's canvas roof. She didn't look at the town, but at the land, the ridge to the south, the timberline, how the wind moved across the valley floor and pushed the dust in a specific direction. Nash Tucker stood beside the general store with his arms crossed, a big man with a sunburned neck and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood he built fences with. He had expected someone else entirely. The marriage broker had sent a photograph, and the woman in the photograph had been smiling, round-faced, dressed in a western blouse. The woman standing in front of him was none of those things. Neither of them spoke on the ride out to the ranch. Nash drove the buckboard with one hand and kept glancing sideways at the lacquered box balanced on her knees. She kept one hand on it, the other resting flat against her thigh, her posture straight enough to balance a book on her head. The ranch was 6 miles north, tucked into a valley between two ridges, a raw log cabin with a porch and a stone chimney, a barn, a few head of cattle, and a small bunkhouse where Nash's mother, Rose, and his 9-year-old daughter, Callie, lived. Rose came to the door when the buckboard pulled up. She was a thin woman with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that had buried a son and a daughter-in-law and kept going. She looked at Yuka, looked at the kimono, looked at the lacquered box, and said nothing except that there was stew on the stove. Callie appeared behind her grandmother's skirt, staring openly at the stranger in the blue silk coat, her mouth half open. Yuka set her trunk down on the porch, bowed once from the waist, and asked in careful, slow English to see the cabin's wood. Rose looked at Nash, and Nash looked at the ground. Yuka ran her fingers along the first log wall, the way a doctor presses a pulse point, slow and deliberate, reading something in the grain that no one else could see. She crouched and smelled the wood, stood and checked where the afternoon sun hit the wall, walked the full perimeter of the cabin twice before she spoke. The wood needed treatment, she told Nash. The logs were pine, cut green, still sweating sap, and in this climate they would rot within 5 years if they were left bare. Nash, said he had planned to paint them with pitch in the fall. She shook her head. She carried the lacquered box to the porch and opened it. Inside, arranged in fitted grooves on a bed of dark silk, were a set of iron tools, a bundle of stiff brush handles wrapped in twine, a small clay pot with a wooden stopper, and a folded paper covered in hand-drawn diagrams that had the look of something copied and recopied over generations. She unfolded the paper and laid it flat on the porch boards. The diagram showed a sequence: fire applied to wood, water poured, ash brushed away, oil rubbed into the surface. Nash studied the drawings. He didn't understand them. She built a small fire pit beside the cabin that afternoon, using 3 of the cabin's spare logs stood on their ends to form a chimney, as the diagrams showed. She lit a twist of dry grass and placed it inside the triangle, and the fire climbed the inner surfaces of the logs with a sound like tearing cloth. The flames blackened the wood to a depth of about 1/8 of an inch, the surface cracking and curling as the sap burned away and the grain tightened. After 7 minutes, she pulled the logs apart and doused them with water from the trough. Steam rose in a white column that the afternoon wind bent sideways across the yard. She brushed the charred surface with a stiff brush until the loose ash fell away, then rubbed oil from the clay pot into the blackened grain with a cloth. The log emerged transformed, dark as river stone, the grain raised in a texture that caught the light differently from every angle, sealed and hard and dry. Nash picked up the end of the log and felt the weight of it. The surface was cool to the touch and left no residue on his fingers. He asked her what it was called, and she said one word in English, the only one she could find for it, and the word was protection. The first townsfolk arrived the next morning. A ranch hand named Webb, who ran the sawmill 2 miles east of town, rode up on a pain horse and sat in the saddle, watching Yucca char a second set of logs. He was a thick man with a red beard and a voice that carried across a valley. He called it the stupidest thing he had ever seen, burning good lumber to protect it, and he said it loud enough for the cattle to hear. 2 more men rode out from town that afternoon, and they stood by the fence and laughed while Yucca knelt beside the wall with fire climbing the grain. Callie watched from the bunkhouse porch with her chin resting on the rail and her eyes following every movement until Rose came to the door, took one look at the smoke, and pulled her inside. Webb rode away still laughing, and the sound of it carried across the valley long after he was out of sight. But the sound that would replace it months later would be something else entirely. The mockery spread through Cedar Hollow, the way smoke spreads through dry timber fast and without anyone deciding to start it. Webb told the story at the saloon that night, and by the next morning every man in town had a version of it. Word was that the Japanese woman was burning the rancher's house, that the rancher was too soft to stop her, that somebody needed to do something before she set the whole valley ablaze. Webb started calling her the Fire Lady, and the name stuck before the week was out. Yucca charred log after log with the same sequence every time: fire, water, brush, oil, a rhythm as steady and predictable as breathing. The blackened walls grew section by section, the cabin transforming from raw yellow pine to something dark and strange that absorbed the sunlight instead of reflecting it. People rode out from town to watch the way they would watch a house fire, not to help, but to see. A few women came with their husbands and stood at a distance, their faces caught between curiosity and disapproval, and none of them spoke to Yucca directly. Webb went to see Polk, who ran the general store, and told him what was happening out at the Tucker place. Polk was a small man with a bald head and a merchant's instinct for which way the wind was blowing. When Yucca came in to buy tung oil for the finishing step, he refused to sell it. He said he wouldn't supply a woman who was going to burn his county down. And he said it loud enough for the two men sitting on the store's porch. Yuka counted out coins on the counter and waited. Polk pushed them back. She picked them up, walked out, and rode the buckboard 6 hours to the next town to buy what she needed. She made the trip alone. Nash didn't offer to go with her. The Sunday after that, there was a gathering at the town hall, a bare plank room above the saloon where the men of Cedar Hollow met when something needed deciding. Webb stood up and said that someone should do something about the Japanese woman before she set the whole valley on fire. A few men nodded. A few others shifted in their seats. Nash was in the back of the room with his hat on his knees, and when the talk swung his way, he said nothing. He left early while Webb was still talking and rode home in the dark. When he got to the ranch, the cabin was lit from inside by a kerosene lantern, the amber glow filtering through the gaps in the charred walls in thin lines that looked like something written in a language he couldn't read. Yuka was still working, brushing ash from the last log of the south wall, her kimono sleeves tied back with cord, her hands black to the wrist. She didn't look at him when he came through the gate. He stood by the porch for a long time, watching her work, and then he went inside the bunkhouse without a word. The cabin glowed behind him like a lantern left burning in an empty field, and the charred walls held the light the way they would hold everything else that came their way. Callie got a splinter in her left hand 2 weeks later, a deep one that broke off beneath the skin when she tried to pull it out. Rose cleaned it with soap and hot water and wrapped it in a rag, and by the next morning the hand had swollen to twice its size, the skin around the wound tight and red and hot to the touch. The nearest doctor was in Bozeman, 2 days' ride south, and the nearest train was 3 days after that. Rose sat on the bunkhouse porch with Callie in her lap, the girl's face flushed with fever, and tried to think what to do. Yuka came out of the cabin carrying the lacquered box. She knelt in front of Callie and took the girl's hand in both of hers, turning it gently, pressing the skin around the wound with her thumbs. Then she opened a different compartment of the box, one Rose hadn't seen before, and pulled out a set of needles so fine they caught no light, along with several small paper packets of dried herbs that smelled like something between moss and pepper. She cleaned the wound with a solution she mixed from the herbs and warm water, drew the splinter out with one of the needles, packed the opening with a paste she made from a different set of herbs, and wrapped the hand in clean cloth with a precision that looked like she had done it 1,000 times. Callie stopped crying within minutes. The pain drained out of her face the way water drains from a basin when the plug is pulled, and by the time the sun was over the ridge, she was asleep in her grandmother's lap, with her good hand still holding Yuka's sleeve. By morning, the swelling was down to half what it had been, and the red had faded to pink. Rose sat on the porch and watched the sunrise and didn't say thank you, but she stopped pulling Callie away from the charring sight. She started leaving a plate of cornbread on the cabin porch every morning without knocking, and she stopped closing the bunkhouse door when Yuka walked past. Nash came back from a 3-day cattle drive to find Callie's hand healed and a plate of cornbread sitting on the charred cabin's porch step. Rose told him what had happened in 5 sentences. No commentary, no opinion, just the facts. Nash crossed the yard to where Yuka was working on the last wall, the north face, her brush moving in long, steady strokes across the blackened grain. He stood there and didn't say thank you, just asked how many logs she had left. She told him. He picked up a brush from the ground beside her, a spare one she had been using for the rough work, and started cleaning ash off a charred board on the wall beside her. He didn't do it well. The strokes were uneven, and he pressed too hard. She didn't correct him. She just kept working beside him, and the silence between them was different from the silence on the buckboard, thicker but less heavy. A silence that happens when two people are doing something together for the first time. Webb rode up that afternoon and saw Nash, with a brush in his hand, ash on his shirt. standing beside the Japanese woman he had spent a month mocking. Webb sat his horse and laughed, a big rolling sound that bounced off the cabin walls. He said something about a rancher doing his wife's strange work, something about a man who had lost his spine along with his good sense. Nash stopped brushing. He turned and looked at Webb, and the look held nothing but the flat patience of a man who has already made a decision and is waiting for the other person to figure it out. He didn't defend Yuka. He didn't raise his voice. He picked up the brush and went back to work. Webb sat his horse for another minute, the laugh dying in his throat, and then he rode away. It wasn't a victory, barely a gesture, but it was the first wall that didn't crack. Summer deepened and the land changed. The spring rains stopped coming in June, and the grass on the valley floor turned from green to a pale brittle yellow that crunched underfoot. The creek behind the barn dropped to a thread, and then to a trickle, and then to a line of damp stones. The air dried out, and the sky went from soft blue to a hard pale white that hurt to look at. Everything that had moisture in it gave that moisture up. The grass, the soil, the timber on the south ridge, all of it drying and drying and drying under a sun that seemed to hang in the sky longer every day. The pine resin on the untreated cabin walls wept and hardened into amber beads that caught the light. The grasshoppers came in clouds that stripped the garden down to stalks in a single afternoon. And the timber on the south ridge, the same timber that had been green and wet when Yuka arrived, turned dry and dark and full of a resin that smelled like turpentine when the wind blew through it. Yuka finished the last log on a Thursday. She oiled the final board by lantern light, the amber glow catching the charred surface and running along the grain in lines that looked like dark water. The lacquered box sat beside her on the porch, empty and clean, every tool back in its fitted groove, the herbs restocked, the diagrams folded and tucked beneath the silk lining. The cabin was complete. Every wall was black and sealed, the surface hard as stone, the grain raised in a texture that shifted from black to silver to dark brown, depending on where the light came from. It stood against the yellow valley like a shadow that had decided to stay. The town had stopped coming to watch. New gossip had replaced the fire lady. A dispute over water rights between two ranchers south of town, a horse thief caught in the next county. Webb still made his jokes when he saw Nash in town, but the jokes had gone thin, repeated too many times to carry the weight they once had. Nash ignored him with the quiet Yuka had shown months before, a silence that comes from having decided something and no longer needing to explain it. He had started learning the method. He asked questions through gestures and simple words, and Yuka answered the same way, showing him with her hands where the fire should sit, how long to let it burn, how much pressure to use with the brush. He built a short fence around the garden plot using her technique, 4 posts and 2 rails, all charred and oiled. It looked odd standing there in the garden, black posts against green bean plants, but he stood back and looked at it with his hands on his hips and something in his face that hadn't been there before. One evening in late July, Nash and Yuka sat on the porch of the charred cabin while the sun went down behind the west ridge. She drank tea from a cup she had brought from Kyoto. He drank coffee from a tin mug. He asked her, in his rough, careful way, why she had come here. She told him about her grandfather, a carpenter in Kyoto, who had built his own house using the charring method, a house that had survived 3 typhoons and a city fire that burned everything around it to the ground. She told him she came because her family had arranged it and because she wanted to build something that would last longer than the people who built it. Nash told her his first wife had died of fever 3 years ago, and he hadn't known how to raise Callie alone, hadn't known how to do any of it, had sent for a bride because he couldn't think of anything else to do. They were 2 people talking for the first time, without a wall between them. And what passed between them wasn't love or even trust, but a recognition. Two people who understood what it meant to stand alone against something bigger than themselves. The kind of recognition that doesn't need a name, because naming it would make it smaller than it is. Then a sound interrupted them, not thunder, but a low, rolling rumble from the south that didn't end the way thunder ends, that kept going and going like something heavy dragging across the sky. Nash stood and looked south, and a column of smoke rose from the ridge, thin and gray against the twilight, climbing into the last light like a finger pointing at something the valley couldn't see yet. Lightning strike, it happened every summer, and he watched it for a moment before sitting back down. Yuka watched the smoke for a long time after Nash looked away. She went inside and filled every bucket and pot and jar in the cabin with water from the trough. 2 days later, the smoke was no longer a column. It was a wall, a gray-brown curtain that stretched across the south ridge from end to end and turned the afternoon sun the color of a bruise. The fire had jumped the ridge and was moving through dry timber toward the valley, and the wind had shifted north, straight at Cedar Hollow and the ranches below it. A rider came through town at a gallop, his horse lathered and wild-eyed, shouting that the fire was 3 miles out and moving faster than a man could run. Cedar Hollow came apart in an hour. People loaded buckboards with whatever they could carry, bedding, food, cash boxes, children, and headed for the river to the east or the open grassland to the south, away from the timber that was feeding the fire. Some went on foot. Some went on horseback. The general store stood open and empty, his door banging in the wind. Polk was last seen driving a mule cart loaded with crates toward the river, his bald head shining with sweat. Webb loaded the sawmill's cash box into a saddlebag and rode north without helping a single person load a single wagon. There was no fire service, no volunteer brigade, no one whose job it was to stand between a town and a wall of flame. The United States Forest Service wouldn't exist for another 22 years. In the Montana Territory of 1883, every man was on his own. Nash saw the fire from the ranch porch at mid-afternoon. It was a red line on the horizon, moving through the timber like something alive, and the wind carried ash and embers and the smell of burning pine across the valley in waves. He calculated the distance and the wind speed the way a rancher calculates feed for the winter, with numbers and instinct and the knowledge that getting it wrong meant something died. The fire would reach the ranch in under 2 hours. His cabin was raw pine logs, still untreated, still sweating sap. So was the barn. So was the bunkhouse. Everything on his property was fuel. Everything except Yuka's charred cabin. The one the town had laughed at, the one Webb had tried to stop, the one Nash had almost been too ashamed to let her finish. He turned to look for her and found her already moving. She was soaking blankets in the trough, filling buckets, clearing dry brush and dead grass from a 10-foot perimeter around the charred cabin's walls. She worked with the same methodical calm she had used on the logs. No panic in her movements, no wasted motion, just the sequence, one step, and then the next, as her grandfather had taught her. She had been filling water containers for 2 days and clearing the perimeter since dawn because she had known what was coming. Nash went to the bunkhouse. Rose was stuffing clothes into a carpet bag with hands that shook. Callie was sitting on the bed with her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes wide and dry, the kind of stillness that comes when a child is too frightened to cry. Nash grabbed them both by the shoulders and said they were going to the black cabin, the one Yuka had built, the one that wouldn't burn. Rose looked at him like he had lost his mind. He said it again, louder, and this time his voice broke on the last word. Rose stopped packing. The air was thick with ash by the time they crossed the yard. Hot and dry and tasting of burned wood, the sky above them the color of a sunset that had gone wrong. Embers were falling around them like rain that never reaches the ground. Small bright pieces of burning timber that drifted on the wind and landed in the dry grass and started small fires that merged and grew. Nash carried Callie on his hip with one arm and held Rose's hand with the other, and the three of them moved through the yard toward the black cabin, while the world turned to orange around them. His own cabin was already burning. An ember had landed on the pitch-soaked roof sometime in the last hour, and the fire had taken hold, and now the whole structure was going, the walls catching, one after another, the glass in the windows cracking from the heat, the smoke pouring from the door frame like something alive. Nash didn't look back. There was nothing to look back at. They reached the charred cabin, and Yuka was holding the door open, her kimono gray with ash, her face calm in a way that had nothing to do with bravery. She had already soaked blankets and hung them over the window frames. On the inside, positioned water buckets at every corner, cleared the floor, and laid out bedding. She stepped aside to let them through, and then a sound came from behind them, hooves on hard ground, and Webb came riding out of the smoke on a lathered horse, riding hard, riding straight for the charred cabin. He dismounted in a stumbling rush and tried to push past Nash through the door. Nash blocked it with his body. The two men stood face to face in the doorway while the firelight turned everything the color of blood. And, for the first time, the confrontation between them was physical. Webb's hands pushing against Nash's chest, Nash's feet planted in the charred dirt. Webb was more afraid than he had ever been in his life, and Nash was bigger, and the difference between them had never been clearer. Yuka appeared in the doorway behind Nash. She looked at Webb, looked at the horse, stamping behind him, looked at the wall of fire coming through the timber. She put her hand on Nash's shoulder and stepped past him, stood aside, and let Webb through. Nash stared at her. She said, in English that was slow and careful and absolutely certain, that there was room. The cabin was small, 12 feet by 12, but the walls were thick and sealed, and the charred surface would hold. Webb stumbled inside without looking at her, his hat gone, his horse loose, every ounce of the authority he had carried when he mocked her, burned out of him along with the sawmill and the town they sealed the door. Yuka had stuffed wet cloth into every gap around the frame, and Nash wedged a charred plank across the inside to brace it. The cabin went dark, except for the amber glow of a kerosene lantern on the floor, the same flickering, warm light that had lit Yuka's work every night for 3 months, 5 people inside a room the size of a horse stall. Callie was pressed against Rose's chest. Webb sat in the corner with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Nash stood at the window, watching through a crack in the shutters. Outside, the world turned orange. The fire reached the cabin like a wave reaching a seawall, a wall of heat and sound and light that broke against the charred exterior and kept coming. The roar was enormous, a sound that covered everything else and left no room for thought, a deep, rolling thunder that came up through the floor and into the bones. The charred walls began to glow where the fire pressed hardest, the surface heating, the black carbon layer absorbing the energy as it had been designed to, absorbing fire on the day Yuka first applied it, only now the fire was 1,000 times larger and the principle held. The wood didn't catch. The carbonized surface charred deeper instead of igniting, the paradox that had made the townsfolk laugh, the principle that had protected her grandfather's house in Kyoto, the science that a United States Forest Service research study would confirm more than a century later. The charred layer deprived the wood beneath it of oxygen. It couldn't burn because it had already been burned. Nash watched through the shutter crack. His ranch house was gone, the walls collapsed inward. the roof fallen, nothing left but a frame of flame that would be ash by morning. The barn was a skeleton of burning timber, the shape of a building without the building, the posts and beams standing like ribs in a fire that had consumed everything between them. The bunkhouse caved in on itself with a sound like a tree falling, the walls folding inward, the roof dropping straight down. The cattle that hadn't scattered were lost. The fence posts, the ones Nash had charred himself using Yucca's method, stood in a row of black posts surrounded by fire, not burning. The same principle at work on a smaller scale, the same protection. 5 years of work, the house he had built with his own hands, the barn he had raised with borrowed lumber. Everything he had owned was being taken apart in front of him. Everything except the black cabin and the black fence. Callie whimpered against Rose's chest. Rose held her and whispered something too quiet to hear over the roar, her eyes closed, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer or might have been a name. Webb had not spoken since Yucca led him through the door. He sat in the corner with his back against a charred wall, his knees drawn up, his face hidden in his arms, and he shook. The man who had stood in his saddle and called Yucca the Fire Lady was pressed against the wall she had built, sheltered by the technique he had tried to stop her from using, and the irony of it sat in the room like a sixth person. Yucca sat with her back against the wall, opposite Nash, the lacquered box on her lap, her eyes closed. She wasn't calm because she was brave. She wasn't calm because she was certain. She was calm because she had already accepted what could happen and had decided it wouldn't change what she did. The kind of calm that only comes from having already faced the worst possible outcome in your mind and found a way to keep working through it. Her grandfather had taught her that, not in words, but in the way. He laid each board the same steady rhythm, whether the sky was clear or full of smoke. The fire passed, the roar became a crackle, the crackle became a hiss, and the hiss became a silence, unlike anything any of them had heard before. The kind of silence that follows destruction, total and absolute. No birds, no wind, no insects, nothing alive to make a sound. Just a low moan of things still cooling, still giving up their heat, still settling into the shapes they would hold when morning came. The charred walls ticked and popped as the temperature dropped, the wood contracting, the carbon surface tightening, and the sound was small and precise and almost gentle after the violence that had come before. Nobody moved for a long time. The kerosene lantern flickered on the floor, the amber light dancing across the charred walls, and the 5 of them sat in it like survivors of a shipwreck, sitting on the one piece of wreckage that had stayed above the water. They opened the door at dawn. The world was gray and black and still, covered in ash the way the valley is covered in snow in January, a thick, soft layer that stuck to everything and tasted of charcoal when it got on the lips. The ranch house was a pile of smoking rubble, the outline of the walls still visible in the ash, the stone chimney standing alone like a monument to something that used to be there. The barn was gone. The bunkhouse was a rectangle of gray on the ground, nothing left standing, nothing left to show. It had been a building except the shape of its foundation pressed into the ash. 2 things stood. The charred cabin, its black walls indistinguishable from the landscape around it, the surface no different than it had been the day before, except for a faint dusting of gray ash that Yucca brushed away with her hand as she stepped through the door, and the short fence Nash had built, 4 blackened posts and 2 rails, still upright in a row, the garden behind it green and unburned, where the charred posts had blocked the embers from reaching the ground. Nash stood in the doorway and looked at what was left of his life. He didn't speak. Rose stepped out behind him and put her hand flat against the cabin wall. The wall she had watched Yucca char 3 months ago, the wall she had thought was a waste of time and good lumber and her hand stayed there for a long time. Callie broke free from her grandmother and ran to Yuka and wrapped her arms around Yuka's waist and pressed her face into the blue silk of the kimono. Yuka put her hand on top of the girl's head and stood there looking out at the gray valley, her jet black hair still pinned in its traditional knot, her face carrying nothing that looked like victory. Webb walked out of the cabin without looking at anyone. He found his horse standing near the trough, somehow still alive, and he climbed into the saddle and rode toward what was left of Cedar Hollow. He didn't say thank you or sorry or anything at all. He just rode, and his horse left ash prints in the gray ground that filled in behind him as the wind moved across the valley floor. Days passed before the survivors of Cedar Hollow came through. The fire had burned through the town too, taken the general store and the saloon and half the houses along the main road, and people were digging through the ash for anything they could save. A cooking pot, a photograph, a piece of harness that hadn't burned. They walked past the ranch on their way to the river crossing, and they saw the black cabin standing in a field of gray, the one structure in the valley that the fire had not been able to touch, and they stopped. They stood in the road and stared. Some of them were the same people who had stood in the road and laughed, while Yuka knelt beside the wall with a torch in her hand. Nash walked out to meet them. Yuka was behind him, carrying the lacquered box, her kimono gray with ash, her hair still pinned, her face the same face she had worn the day she stepped off the buckboard. Nash looked at the group of survivors standing in the road, and he didn't give a speech, and he didn't say they were wrong, and he didn't say she was right. He put his arm around Yuka's shoulder and said 4 words, "That's my wife." The same protective claim, quiet and absolute, spoken the way a man stakes a fence post, not loud but final. No one argued and no one laughed. The silence that followed was the loudest sound the valley had made since the fire, and every person standing in that road understood exactly what it meant. Yuka knelt in the ash beside the road and opened the lacquered box. She took out the fine needles and the packets of dried herbs, and she started treating burns on a man's arm, the same man who had stood outside the general store and watched Polk refuse to sell her oil. She cleaned the wound and applied a poultice and wrapped it in clean cloth and didn't look up. She just worked, the same sequence she had always worked, one step and then the next, as her grandfather had taught her, and as she would one day teach her own daughter, the knowledge surviving for centuries by being useful when everything else failed. The town rebuilt around her method, and no one laughed again. The last building standing was the one they tried to stop her from building. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.